The story of Cleopatra begins not with a love affair, nor with a tragic death, but with a dynasty in decline. Egypt in the 1st century before Christ was no longer the mighty empire of the pharaohs who built pyramids and ruled across millennia. Instead, it was the realm of the Ptolemies, a Macedonian Greek family that had governed Egypt since the days of Alexander the Great. By the time Cleopatra was born in 69 BC, this dynasty was 3 centuries old, fraying at its edges and deeply entangled with the rising power of Rome. Cleopatra VII Philopator was a daughter of Ptolemy XIII Auletes, known as the flute player king. His reign was marked by political instability and heavy dependence on Rome. To keep his fragile throne, Ptolemy XIII paid vast sums to Roman generals and senators, plunging Egypt into debt. When he was driven into exile, it was Roman arms that restored him. His rule left a legacy of weakness, corruption, and dependence. Yet it also prepared the stage for his daughter, who would inherit not only his crown, but also the precarious balancing act between Egyptian sovereignty and Roman dominance. When Ptolemy XIII died in 51 BC, Cleopatra was around 18 years old. According to Egyptian custom, she was named co-ruler alongside her younger brother Ptolemy III, who was barely a child. To solidify their reign, they were married. Sibling marriages were a long tradition in the Ptolemaic dynasty, meant to preserve the purity of their Macedonian bloodline and to emulate the gods. But beneath the ceremony, tension brewed. Real power does not share easily, and the fragile arrangement between Cleopatra and her brother was destined to collapse. Cleopatra was unlike the rulers before her. The Ptolemies, though they wore the crowns of the pharaohs, rarely bothered to learn the Egyptian language or embrace Egyptian culture. They ruled as Greek monarchs in an Egyptian land, their court centered in Alexandria, the glittering city of Alexander's dream. Cleopatra, however, broke from this pattern. She is said to have spoken multiple languages: Greek, Egyptian, and possibly Hebrew, Aramaic, and others. Ancient writers noted that she could address envoys without interpreters, a rare skill for a monarch. For the Egyptian people, long ruled by foreigners, this was not a small thing. Cleopatra was not only their queen, she spoke as one of them. She also understood power in symbolic terms. Unlike her ancestors, who often presented themselves simply as kings in a foreign land, Cleopatra embraced the imagery of Egyptian religion. She associated herself with the goddess Isis, mother and protector, casting herself as the living embodiment of divine order. Coins bore her likeness with the crown of Isis. Festivals reinforced the idea that the queen was not merely a politician, but also a sacred figure. By doing this, Cleopatra wrapped herself in myth as much as in power. She was at once a monarch of flesh and a goddess in the eyes of her people. The first years of her reign were turbulent. Egypt's position was fragile. Grain shortages threatened famine. Debts to Rome strained the treasury. And the Nile, lifeblood of the land, was unpredictable. Cleopatra faced not only these challenges, but also the hostility of her brother's advisors, who resented her independence and influence. By 48 BC, the rivalry erupted into open conflict. Cleopatra was forced to flee Alexandria, while Ptolemy III's regents controlled the city. Yet exile did not mean defeat. Cleopatra gathered support in the countryside, preparing for the moment to strike back. This was the world of the young queen, a fractured dynasty, a kingdom shadowed by Rome, and a throne balanced precariously between family betrayal and foreign intervention. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, the last to rule before Rome swallowed the ancient kingdom into its empire. And from the very beginning, she showed that her reign would be different. Not only the rule of a monarch, but the creation of a myth that would outlive empires. To understand Cleopatra, one must understand the mask she wore and the myth she wove. She was not the first Ptolemaic ruler to borrow from the religion of Egypt, but she did so with a mastery no one before her had achieved. Where her ancestors had been Macedonian kings who ruled over Egypt, Cleopatra made herself into an Egyptian queen who ruled as a goddess. The goddess she chose was Isis, the mother, the healer, the protector of kings. In Egyptian belief, Isis was not only the wife of Osiris and the mother of Horus, she was the eternal force of love, protection, and resurrection. She represented fertility and order, the very continuity of life itself. By aligning herself with Isis, Cleopatra claimed a divine authority that no Roman or rival sibling could easily contest. To oppose Cleopatra was to oppose the goddess who sustained the cosmos. Her image as Isis was carefully cultivated. Coins minted during her reign did not simply display a monarch. They showed Cleopatra with the diadem of Isis, sometimes with a vulture headdress or the solar disk. Temple reliefs carved her likeness alongside divine figures, blurring the line between mortal and goddess. In festivals and ceremonies, she appeared not merely as queen, but as the incarnation of Egypt's most beloved deity. In a land weary of foreign rulers, this mattered profoundly. Cleopatra was not a Greek stranger ruling Egypt. She was Egypt itself, yet she did not abandon her Greek heritage. This was Cleopatra's brilliance. She could play many roles at once. To the Egyptian priests, she was Isis reborn. To the Alexandrian elites, she was the cultured heir of Alexander's dynasty. To foreign emissaries, she was a ruler fluent in diplomacy, wit, and language. Ancient writers recorded that she could converse in many tongues, addressing Syrians, Ethiopians, Jews, and Arabs without interpreters. This was no small skill. It was a display of authority. By speaking in another's language, Cleopatra not only communicated, but also dominated, showing that she could step into their world while remaining firmly in her own. Religion was her armor, but politics was her battlefield. From the moment she claimed the crown, Cleopatra understood that survival depended on securing both the devotion of her people and the recognition of Rome. Egypt's wealth, its grain, its gold, its strategic ports, was coveted by Roman generals and senators. For Rome, Egypt was the jewel that could feed an empire. For Cleopatra, Rome was the storm that could drown her throne. To stand against it, she needed more than armies. She needed myth. In this way, Cleopatra's reign blurred the boundary between history and story. She performed divinity not as a distant abstraction, but as an intimate presence. In Alexandria, processions carried her through the streets dressed as Isis, her subjects kneeling as though before a goddess. Offerings at temples bore her name alongside divine inscriptions. Even in her private chambers, she cultivated an aura of sacred power, surrounding herself with imagery of rebirth, fertility, and the eternal Nile. But divine imagery was not only for the people, it was also a message to her enemies. When Cleopatra presented herself as Isis, she was not merely claiming the right to rule Egypt. She was daring Rome to challenge a goddess. For a republic that feared both monarchy and the allure of the East, this was intoxicating and dangerous. Cleopatra embodied what Rome both desired and despised: beauty, wealth, intelligence, and divinity wrapped into one. Her power was not only symbolic. She took an active role in governance, overseeing grain distribution during famine, reorganizing finances strained by her father's debts, and maintaining Egypt's independence at a time when kingdoms across the Mediterranean were falling under Roman control. She knew that a queen could not simply look like Isis. She had to act as Isis, a provider and protector. In Cleopatra's Egypt, myth and politics were inseparable. Each decree, each coin, each festival was both an act of governance and a chapter in her legend. She lived as both mortal and goddess, a woman of flesh and blood who nevertheless walked in the shadow of eternity. And so, while her enemies in Rome would later reduce her to a caricature, a seductress, a temptress, a danger to their values. Within Egypt, she was more than a queen. She was a goddess among mortals, the last to sit upon the throne of the pharaohs, with both the authority of history and the aura of divinity. The river Nile has always been more than water. It is life itself, a current of rebirth flowing through the body of Egypt. And it was along this river, in the year 48 BC, that two figures met whose fates would ripple across history. Cleopatra, the young queen struggling to secure her throne, and Julius Caesar, the most powerful man of Rome. At this moment, Cleopatra's position was perilous. Driven from Alexandria by the advisors of her brother Ptolemy III, she lingered in exile, raising what forces she could in the countryside. The city itself was divided, controlled by Ptolemy's regents and shaken by unrest. Egypt, fractured, stood at risk of falling completely into Roman hands. Then fortune or fate delivered to her Julius Caesar. Caesar had come to Alexandria in pursuit of his rival Pompey. The Roman civil war had spilled into Egypt, and Pompey sought refuge with the young Ptolemy III. Instead of shelter, he found betrayal. Ptolemy's advisors murdered him, hoping to please Caesar. But when Pompey's severed head was presented to him, Caesar recoiled. This was not loyalty, it was dishonor. And in that dishonor, he saw weakness. Caesar took control of Alexandria, positioning himself as arbiter of Egypt's royal dispute. For Cleopatra, this was both danger and opportunity. If she could win Caesar, she could win her throne. Yet she could not walk openly into Alexandria. The city was hostile to her. So the queen turned to cunning. Ancient writers tell us she was smuggled into Caesar, his presence rolled up inside a carpet, or perhaps a sack of linen. From this bundle emerged not a defeated exile, but a queen, her wit and charisma shining in the lamplight. The tale may be embellished, but its meaning is clear. Cleopatra knew the power of theatre, and she used it to transform a clandestine arrival into a legend. Caesar was 52, Cleopatra barely in her 20s. Yet age and power did not intimidate her. She spoke with confidence, intelligence, and humor. Plutarch, one of her biographers, tells us that her allure was not only in beauty. Indeed, some sources suggest she was not conventionally the most beautiful woman of her age, but in her presence. Her voice, her charm, her wit, and her ability to make every conversation feel intimate and alive, that was Cleopatra's true weapon. Caesar, weary of betrayal and bloodshed, found in her both an ally and a fascination. Together they formed an alliance. Cleopatra would regain her throne, and Caesar would secure Egypt's loyalty and grain supply for Rome. With his legions and her cunning, they forced Ptolemy III into battle. The conflict culminated in the Battle of the Nile, where Caesar's troops and Cleopatra's supporters crushed Ptolemy's forces. Ptolemy himself drowned in the river that had given Egypt life for millennia. Cleopatra was restored as queen, now ruling alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, but in truth wielding power herself. The alliance between Cleopatra and Caesar was not merely political, it was personal. Cleopatra bore him a son, Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, known to history as Caesarion, Little Caesar. His very existence was both hope and danger. For Cleopatra, he was the heir who could unite Egypt and Rome. For Rome, he was a potential threat, a living reminder that Caesar's legacy might stretch beyond the Tiber and into the Nile. In Alexandria, Cleopatra and Caesar lived like royalty, blending the grandeur of Egypt with the might of Rome. They sailed together on the Nile, holding court amid splendor, presenting themselves almost as Isis and Osiris reborn. To the Egyptians, this was divine union. To the Romans, it was scandalous. For in Cleopatra, they saw not just a queen, but a woman who might bend Caesar himself to her will. And indeed, Cleopatra was no mere consort. She stood beside Caesar in public, discussed politics openly, and accompanied him to Rome itself. When she visited the Eternal City, she lodged in one of Caesar's villas and dazzled the Roman elite with her presence. To some, she was exotic, fascinating, a living goddess. To others, she was dangerous, a foreign queen threatening Roman values with her opulence and influence. Statues of her as Isis appeared in Rome, unsettling those who feared the East's allure. But Cleopatra understood something essential. Alliances with men like Caesar were not about surrender, but survival. Egypt could not stand against Rome alone. Yet Egypt, with Cleopatra at its helm, could weave myth and politics together so tightly that even Rome would have to take notice. In Caesar, Cleopatra found not only a partner in politics, but a stage on which to perform her greatest role. The queen who could rule empires through intellect, charisma, and the subtle art of myth. But history is never still. Caesar's fate would soon be decided not by Cleopatra, but by daggers in the Roman Senate. And when he fell, Cleopatra's story would take yet another turn into the arms of another Roman general and into the fire of a love that would define legend. After Caesar's death in 44 BC, Rome was thrown into chaos. The Ides of March shattered the Republic's fragile balance, and with Caesar gone, Cleopatra's position became perilous once more. She returned to Egypt, her son Caesarion at her side, aware that the world she had carefully built with Caesar had collapsed in a single heartbeat. Yet Cleopatra was not a woman to retreat into obscurity. She watched, waited, and when the tides of Roman politics shifted, she seized her chance again. The vacuum left by Caesar's assassination drew Rome into civil war. The assassins Brutus and Cassius held power in the east. In Rome itself, Caesar's heir Octavian and his ally Mark Antony struggled to consolidate their rule. Antony, a seasoned general, was charismatic, bold, and larger than life, a man of appetites and passions. He was also one of Caesar's most loyal commanders. For Cleopatra, this made him both an opportunity and a risk. In 41 BC, Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus, a city in Asia Minor, demanding that she explain why she had not aided Rome more fully in the aftermath of Caesar's death. Cleopatra understood that this meeting was no mere interrogation, it was theater, and she arrived accordingly. Ancient accounts describe how she sailed up the river Cydnus in a golden barge, its sails purple, its oars silver, perfumed with incense. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a canopy, dressed as Aphrodite, while attendants disguised as Cupids fanned her. To Antony, this was not a queen arriving. This was a goddess descending. Antony, ever drawn to spectacle, was captivated. Cleopatra's brilliance was that she knew exactly how to play to his nature. He loved grandeur, extravagance, and indulgence. She gave him all of these, and more. Where Caesar had been disciplined, cautious, and calculating, Antony was passionate, impulsive, and hungry for glory. Cleopatra matched him step for step, offering both pleasure and power. Their partnership quickly turned into an alliance of love and politics. Cleopatra invited Antony to Alexandria, where he found a city rich in wealth, culture, and beauty. There, the two lived in what Roman sources later described with scandal as excess. They dined lavishly, drank deeply, and formed a society known as the inimitable livers, where pleasure and philosophy mingled freely. But beneath the luxury was strategy. Cleopatra secured Antony's loyalty. Antony secured her throne. Together, they dreamed not of surviving Rome's dominance, but of challenging it. Antony returned to Rome, but could not sever his bond with Cleopatra. When he came back to Egypt, their lives entwined more deeply. Cleopatra bore him 3 children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. Their union was more than romance. It was a dynastic statement. Cleopatra and Antony envisioned an empire stretching east and west, a new Alexander's dream with Egypt at its heart. This alarmed Octavian. In Rome, he spread propaganda painting Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress, a foreign queen who had bewitched Antony and turned him against his Roman duties. Coins, speeches, and decrees emphasized Antony's betrayal of Rome under Cleopatra's spell. To Octavian, Antony was not a rival general. He was a man enslaved by lust. Cleopatra was the true enemy. But within Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony presented themselves not as scandal, but as divinity. They styled themselves as Isis and Dionysus, gods of life and ecstasy. Public ceremonies displayed them as rulers not only of Egypt, but of the world. The donations of Alexandria, a grand political gesture, distributed eastern territories among Cleopatra's children, and proclaimed Caesarion, her son by Caesar, as the rightful heir to Caesar's legacy. For Rome, this was provocation. For Egypt, it was triumph. The love between Antony and Cleopatra has echoed for centuries, not merely because of romance, but because it symbolized defiance. Against the growing shadow of Rome, they embodied a dream of independence, of passion stronger than politics, of a world in which Egypt might rise again as the center of power. Yet the very extravagance that made their union legendary also made it vulnerable. For in the end, Rome was not a lover easily betrayed, and Octavian would not allow Cleopatra and Antony's vision to live. Their story, bound by love and ambition, was destined to end not in victory but in tragedy. If Cleopatra was a queen in Egypt, in Rome she became a monster. It was a weapon, sharpened and wielded by one man, Octavian, the future Augustus. Octavian was Caesar's adopted heir, a youth who rose quickly in the turbulent years after his uncle's assassination. Unlike Antony, he was not a soldier of fire and charisma. He was cautious, deliberate, and ruthless in politics. To defeat Antony, he needed more than armies. He needed a story that could turn Rome against his rival. That story was Cleopatra. In Roman propaganda, Cleopatra became everything Rome feared about the East. She was portrayed as a sorceress who bewitched Antony, a foreign temptress who corrupted Roman virtue, a decadent queen whose luxuries would drain the Republic dry. Pamphlets, speeches, and whispered rumors painted Antony not as a general making his own choices, but as a man enslaved by lust. Cleopatra was cast as the spider at the center of the web, drawing Rome's greatest soldier into her silken trap. The reality, of course, was far more complex. Cleopatra was no enchantress weaving spells. She was a ruler securing her throne, a strategist navigating survival between two empires. But Rome thrived on symbols, and Octavian knew that a foreign queen was the perfect enemy. By demonizing Cleopatra, he turned Antony's war into something more than a civil conflict. It became a crusade to save Rome itself. Every excess of Alexandria was exaggerated. The feasts, the ceremonies, the inimitable livers, all were painted as grotesque indulgence. Cleopatra was shown not as Isis, but as a parody of divinity, a decadent threat to Roman morality. Antony's donations of territory to Cleopatra's children were framed not as political maneuvers, but as betrayal. A Roman general giving away the empire's lands to a foreign dynasty. The most dangerous claim of all was about Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar. Octavian insisted that Antony and Cleopatra intended to place Caesarion above him, to make the boy ruler not only of Egypt, but of Rome. If Caesar's bloodline were restored through Caesarion, Octavian's own legitimacy would collapse. Thus, Cleopatra was not just a foreign queen, she was a threat to Octavian's very life and legacy. Roman writers like Horace, Virgil, and Propertius later echoed this image. In Virgil's Aeneid, Cleopatra appears as a monstrous queen, fighting against Rome at Actium, with the barking of Anubis and the gods of Egypt at her side. To the Romans, she was not a human ruler, but a symbol of chaos, the dangerous seductions of the East threatening Rome's order and discipline. But propaganda works best when it draws on some truth. Cleopatra was indeed powerful, charismatic, and ambitious. She did live with Antony in splendor, did present herself as a goddess, did proclaim her son as Caesar's heir. These realities, twisted through Octavian's words, became weapons sharper than any sword. And so, by the time the conflict reached its climax, Rome was prepared not simply to fight Antony, it was prepared to destroy Cleopatra. She was no longer seen as a queen defending her throne, but as a menace to the Republic itself. Her image, carefully built in Egypt as Isis reborn, was shattered in Rome into the mask of a witch, a seductress, an enemy of all that was Roman. It is one of history's cruelest ironies that Cleopatra, who so masterfully used myth to strengthen her power, was herself destroyed by myth. Her enemies spun a tale darker than any she could weave, and the world believed it. From this crucible of words, the stage was set for the final confrontation. Not only armies would clash at Actium, but stories, the story of Rome's virtue against the East's corruption, of discipline against decadence, of Octavian against Cleopatra. And in that story, written long before the first ship set sail, Cleopatra was destined to lose. The summer of 31 BC brought the reckoning. For years, the tension between Octavian and Antony had simmered, boiling into propaganda, political maneuvering, and accusations shouted across the Mediterranean. But words, sharp as they were, would no longer suffice. The struggle for the fate of Rome and Egypt would be decided at sea, in a narrow gulf on the western coast of Greece, Actium. Cleopatra and Antony had gathered their forces, a formidable fleet of warships and tens of thousands of soldiers. Their vision was bold, to strike Octavian's forces and carve out an empire of their own, stretching from Rome's eastern provinces to Egypt's fertile Nile. Yet their strength was also their weakness. Their ships were massive, heavily armored, designed for power, not speed. Octavian's admiral, Marcus Agrippa, commanded a fleet lighter, quicker, built for maneuver. In the tight waters of Actium, this difference would prove decisive. The days before the battle were heavy with dread. In Antony's camp, morale faltered. The soldiers knew the propaganda that Rome had spread, that they were fighting not for Antony, but for Cleopatra, for a foreign queen who sought to enslave Rome. In Octavian's camp, unity was forged by fear and patriotism. His men believed they were defending the Republic itself against decadence and betrayal. In truth, both sides fought for power, but stories make soldiers stronger than truth. On the morning of the battle, the sea was calm, the sky bright. Antony's great galleys rowed out, oars cutting the water like wings, their bronze rams gleaming. Cleopatra's ships were there too, resplendent with Egyptian banners and sails that caught the sun. Facing them, Agrippa's fleet fanned out, nimble and ready, their crews hardened by months of preparation. What happened next has been told in many ways, but all accounts agree. The battle was fierce, chaotic, and swift. Agrippa's lighter ships darted among Antony's lumbering giants, striking, retreating, striking again. Fires broke out, shouts echoed across the waves. The sea turned red with battle. Antony fought bravely, but his forces began to crumble under the relentless tactics of Agrippa. Then came the moment that turned the battle into legend. Cleopatra, aboard her flagship, saw the tide shifting. Her fleet raised its sails and broke through the fighting lines, fleeing the battle. Some say she panicked, others that she acted on a plan, preserving what remained of Egypt's strength. Antony, seeing her retreat, made the fateful choice to follow. Leaving his men behind, he broke from the fight to join her. To Octavian's soldiers, the sight was confirmation of every rumor. Antony had abandoned Rome for the Queen of Egypt. To Antony's own men, it was betrayal, their general deserting them in their hour of need. Leaderless, the fleet collapsed. Ships surrendered or burned, soldiers scattered, the sea became a graveyard of iron and ash. The Battle of Actium was more than a defeat. It was the end of a dream. Cleopatra and Antony, once rulers of half the world in their imagination, now fled with only fragments of their power. Octavian's victory was absolute. He would soon march into Egypt itself, and with him came not only legions, but the weight of Rome's new destiny. For Cleopatra, the dream of a revived pharaonic empire died that day on the waters of Actium. For Antony, the loyalty of his men evaporated in the salt spray. And for Octavian, Actium was not only a military triumph, but a symbolic one. The victory of Roman order over Eastern excess, of discipline over decadence, of propaganda made real by the clash of oars and steel. But battles do not end stories. They only open new chapters. Cleopatra and Antony still lived, and their legend was not yet finished. Defeated at sea, they would return to Alexandria, where love, loyalty, and death would entwine in one of history's most unforgettable finales. The defeat at Actium was more than a military disaster. It was the slow unraveling of two lives bound by love and ambition. Cleopatra and Antony returned to Alexandria, their dreams shattered, yet their story not yet finished. For in Alexandria, the stage was set for a final act that would echo through history, a death remembered not simply as an end, but as the birth of legend. In the months after Actium, Antony's world collapsed piece by piece. His allies deserted him, his legions dwindled, his prestige evaporated. Once hailed as one of Rome's greatest generals, he now found himself besieged within the city that had once been the jewel of his power. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, weighed her options. Could she negotiate with Octavian? Could Egypt be spared if she surrendered? Or was her fate sealed, no matter what she offered? Octavian advanced relentlessly. By 30 BC, his legions reached Alexandria, and the city braced itself for the inevitable. Inside its walls, Cleopatra and Antony faced not only the enemy at their gates, but also the crumbling of their bond. Desperation corrodes even the strongest ties. Rumors spread. Cleopatra was negotiating secretly with Octavian. Antony raged at betrayal. Trust faltered. Yet beneath the anger lay love, frayed but unbroken. The end came swiftly. As Octavian's troops stormed the city, Antony's forces were overwhelmed. In the chaos, Antony received false news. Cleopatra was dead. Stricken with grief, he chose not to live without her. Drawing his sword, he fell upon it, mortally wounded. But before death claimed him, word reached him that Cleopatra still lived, hidden in her mausoleum. With his last strength, he was carried to her. There, in the dim chamber, the two lovers met one final time. Antony, bleeding and broken, was lifted to Cleopatra's side. Ancient accounts tell us she tore at her robes, covered herself in his blood, and wept as he died in her arms. In that moment, the grandeur of generals and queens vanished, leaving only two people undone by fate, by love, by the weight of their choices. Antony died, and Cleopatra was left alone, facing the storm. Octavian soon entered Alexandria in triumph. The city bowed before him, and Cleopatra, once the goddess of Egypt, was reduced to a prisoner in her own palace. Octavian intended to parade her through Rome in chains, a living trophy of his conquest. For Cleopatra, this was unbearable. To live as a spectacle, humiliated before the crowds, was a fate worse than death. And so, she prepared her own ending. Accounts differ. Some say she arranged to be bitten by an asp, the sacred Egyptian cobra, smuggled into her chamber in a basket of figs. Others suggest she used a poisoned ointment or a hollow comb. Whatever the means, the image has endured. Cleopatra, dressed in her finest robes, adorned as a queen, choosing death on her own terms. On August 12, 30th BC, she ended her life, perhaps with her two loyal handmaidens beside her, leaving the world to wonder at the method, but never to forget the act. Her death was not only personal, but symbolic. With Cleopatra fell the Ptolemaic dynasty, and with it the last vestige of independent Egypt. The land of the pharaohs became a province of Rome. Octavian emerged as Augustus, Rome's first emperor, his triumph sealed by the death of the queen who had dared to defy him. Yet Cleopatra's death was not silence, it was spectacle. Even in defeat, she commanded the stage, shaping her final act as carefully as she had shaped her life. To Romans, she was the foreign temptress undone by her own schemes. To Egyptians, she was the goddess who refused to be shamed. To poets and playwrights, she was tragedy itself, a woman whose love and pride burned too brightly to endure. And so, the queen who styled herself as Isis became immortal not through temples or monuments, but through story. Her mausoleum crumbled, her body was lost to time, but her legend endured. Cleopatra did not leave history quietly. She left it in a blaze of myth. The death of Cleopatra closed one chapter of history, but opened another in legend. Rarely has a historical figure been so completely reshaped by those who came after. To her subjects, she had been Isis reborn. To Octavian and Rome, she was a dangerous enchantress. To later ages, she became everything from a tragic heroine to a femme fatale. Cleopatra's life ended in Alexandria, but her story never died. In Rome, the narrative was clear. Cleopatra had been the foreign queen who corrupted Antony, lured him away from duty, and brought war upon the Republic. Roman poets and historians, Virgil, Horace, Propertius, Plutarch, preserved this image. Virgil's Aeneid cast her as a monstrous figure, fighting against Rome with the barking of Anubis, a queen of superstition against the gods of Rome. Horace mocked her as a drunken woman undone by excess. Octavian's triumph was magnified by her vilification. In their words, she was not a ruler, but a symbol of Rome's victory over chaos, decadence, and the East. Yet even in those hostile accounts, Cleopatra's power shone through. For if she was merely a woman, why did Rome fear her so much? Why was she remembered at all? The answer lies in her extraordinary ability to craft myth. She had lived as Isis, performed as goddess and queen, and turned her very presence into theater. Rome sought to destroy her image, yet in doing so, they preserved it. Through the Middle Ages, Cleopatra became both warning and wonder. To Christian moralists, she was the epitome of sinful womanhood, a temptress whose beauty brought down men and empires. To others, she was a tragic lover, undone not by sin, but by destiny. In the Renaissance, playwrights like Shakespeare reimagined her in Antony and Cleopatra as a figure of passion and grandeur, both majestic and flawed. Painters like Tiepolo and Cabanel captured her final moments, draped in silks, the asp at her breast, a queen even in death. By the 19th century, Cleopatra had become a symbol of the exotic Orient, mysterious, alluring, dangerous. Opera houses staged her story, novels embellished her beauty, often beyond recognition. Archaeologists sought her tomb, which remains undiscovered, adding another layer of mystery to her legend. In the 20th century, Hollywood claimed her. Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra dazzled audiences in 1963, cementing her image as the ultimate queen of seduction and power. Pop culture embraced her as a figure of glamour, tragedy, and strength. Songs, films, even fashion drew on her name. She was no longer simply a queen of Egypt, she was an icon. And yet, beneath the layers of myth, the historical Cleopatra still speaks. She was not merely beauty or seduction. Ancient accounts emphasize her intellect, her languages, her wit, her ability to rule in a world where women rarely wielded power. She was a strategist who held her throne for over 2 decades in the face of famine, debt, rebellion, and Rome itself. She was the last pharaoh, the last to embody both the grandeur of Egypt and the cunning of survival. Her myth endures because it touches something eternal in us. Cleopatra embodies the paradox of power and love, of brilliance and vulnerability, of mortality wrapped in divinity. She is at once a ruler and a lover, a woman of flesh and a goddess of story. She is history's reminder that even in defeat there is a kind of immortality, not in monuments of stone, but in the tales told forever after. Cleopatra's tomb is lost. Her body has vanished, but her story remains, carried across centuries by poets, painters, and dreamers. The queen, who once wrapped herself in myth, succeeded beyond her imagination. She became myth itself. Dear listener, good night.